मेरा नाम अमर शौकत है। मैं काफ़ी अरसे से PhD कैंडिडेट था एट यूनिवर्सिटी ऑफ वर्जीनिया in philosophical theology, which basically means intersection of आप समझते हैं फ़लसफ़ा और मतलब गैर इस्लामी गैर दीनी फ़लसफ़ा और दीनी फ़लसफ़ा। थियोलॉजी यहाँ पे अमेरिका में जनरली उस चीज़ को कहा जाता है जिसके अंदर सोर्सेज आपकी मुख्तलिफ होती हैं फिलॉसफी से। सोर्सेज से मतलब ये कि वो मवाद जिसकी बेसिस पे आप डिस्कशन करते हैं। तो जब भी उसमें रिलीजन की चीज़ें आ जाती हैं, बाइबल आ गया या कुरान आ गया हमारी सिचुएशन में, तो उसको थियोलॉजी कहा जाता है। और जब आप मतलब समझें कि प्लेटो आ गया, एरिस्टोटल आ गया, कांट आ गया, या अगर आप लोग ये नाम सुने हैं तो अच्छी बात है, नहीं सुने तो कोई बात नहीं, as we go along तो इंशाल्लाह फिर होते जाएंगे। तो ये दोनों सब्जेक्ट है, जो इन दोनों सब्जेक्ट्स का जो सब्जेक्ट मैटर है, जो इनका मौजू है, एक ही जैसा ऑब्वियसली थोड़े फर्क इंट्रोड्यूस होना शुरू हो जाते हैं डिपेंडिंग ऑन अगर आप खुदा के वजूद की बात कर रहे हैं अलग तरह से बहस होगी। अगर आप ये बात कर रहे हैं कि डेमोक्रेसी जो है वो सबसे बेहतर निज़ाम है कि नहीं है, तो उसमें फिर अलग तरीके से बात होगी। So anyway, that was my area of studies for a long time, and I was then also a professor at IBA in Karachi। 2 साल मैं उधर था, 2.5 साल तकरीबन, और अभी जो है मैं रिसेंटली USA दोबारा रिलोकेट करा हूँ एंड यहाँ पे अभी टीचिंग पोजीशन नहीं हासिल की है, मगर इंशाल्लाह इरादा है कि यहाँ किसी लोकल यूनिवर्सिटी मिशिगन में ही फिलॉसफी और इस्लामिक फिलॉसफी इस तरह की चीज़ें पढ़ाएंगे। Okay, so let's start. The topic that I was asked by the team to address was why modernity matters. Why modernity matters? I mean, we have lots of ways of thinking about this issue. In my mind, what I have done is basically I'm going to divide this discussion into 3 parts. First, I will talk about where does modernity come from? Whence, this should have been hence modernity, not whence is modernity, but anyway, yes, this document will probably also have typos because this is literally just me hammering out some thoughts quickly. And then the second section of the discussion is going to focus on what is modernity, right? So what is the definition of modernity? The first one focuses on how does modernity come about, what are its historical, sociological roots. And the second one focuses on what is modernity itself, how do we understand it. And then the third one is where you will get why does modernity matter, which is really the subject matter for our discussion today. But you know, we have to set up the grounds to get into that, and that's what the first 2 sections are going to do. Thank you.
Very nice.
So let's look at the first issue, which is where does modernity come from. अच्छा, so देखिए इसके अंदर so there are, depending on who you are, or depending on what your area of study is, depending on your field, your interest, your subject matter, all of these things matter. Your skills in languages, all of those things can combine to create a disciplinary kind of an effect. If you're in the history department, you might have certain biases in the way you will define and understand the history behind modernity. To give you a very interesting example, and Siri Temur can talk about it more than I can actually. Within art and architecture, modernity or modernism will mean something quite different than it would for somebody like in the philosophy department, or theology department for somebody like me. What I've tried to do is put together some of the big points that people have discussed as historical reasons or historical events that happened behind modernity. For now, all I want you to think about when you hear the word modernity, when I'm using this right now, think of our contemporary world. The world that we live in right now. This is the most generic, the most simple use of the word modern, not modernity, but modern in how we use the word, okay? Fair. So some of the historical events that people will point to behind the rise of modernity, or sort of starting the chain of events which lead up to the world that we live in now. Number one, it might be the Industrial Revolution. And this is something that starts in the middle or the late 18th century in Great Britain. And whatever you understand by the word industry or factory production right now, that is where it was taking root and taking hold. It greatly mechanized production systems, introduced a lot of efficiency compared to your agrarian societies before. By the way, I might be using certain words over here. If you're not very clear about it, you might think I'm being positive or negative. Okay, I'm not trying to make any value judgments. When I say something like it introduced great efficiency, that doesn't mean I'm saying it's a good thing. Okay, so in my presentation, for now at least, I'm just talking about, I'm trying to describe what's happening. Okay, not saying whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. That will happen later on. So Industrial Revolution is one of those events that people will point to because it radically will change society. One of the things it will do, for example, is it will create waves of urbanization, making people leave village life and move into cities. Right? So, the big cities that we see, metropolitan cities like Karachi, Lahore, these, now they're basically known as the mega cities in the literature. People don't even to refer to them as cities. Is tarah ki, the setup that we see now was unheard of. I mean, think of it this way. The Islamic history, which were the greatest capitals, the greatest cities that the medieval Islamic civilization produced, they would dwarf in front of places like, if you just put together Rawalpindi and Islamabad. The population was that little. Anyway, so Industrial Revolution is one thing that people will point to. Another one that people might point to are, say, the American and French revolutions. American and French revolutions will occur towards the later half, of the 18th century. Iske andar, what we are looking at predominantly is within a few decades of each other, these two revolutions happened, and what they brought about was this broad level of questioning within people, or within at least the American and French people, that monarchies are not a good thing. Rulers ruling in the name of divine right, that God has appointed them, that is not a good thing. That is not a sufficient way in which you can justify your existence as a ruler, and equal representation of the population that you're ruling over. The rulers have to allow for that representation and take. Sorry. So those two events are going to happen. The big one probably out of these two, even though American is often something that we will hear about a lot, but in terms of its impact, in terms of its resonance across the world, is probably the French Revolution. 1789 it occurs. It inspired even movements in what we would call the colonized world. So आप लोगों ने शायद सुना Haitian Revolution that occurred in, again, a couple of decades down the line from the French Revolution. Even people over there, this was a rebellion of the slaves. Even they were inspired to a very large extent by the French Revolution and the demands for freedom that they were launching within the French Revolution. So those two revolutions are seen as another kind of cause behind modernity. Now, as you can see, Industrial Revolution focuses more on technological changes, focuses more on economic changes, whereas the American and French Revolution, if we talk about them as the cause of modernity or the occasion of modernity, you're talking about the political or maybe to a certain extent certain social changes that are going to come about. Another third one that is given often is your search for the new world. You might have heard the 1492 Christopher Columbus sets out in search for India, comes across America, calls those people who were living there Indians. That's why we still call them native Indians or American Indians. That was one of the earliest interactions that old world, by the old world we mean over here, Europe had with the new world, and new world over here means basically the Americas, right? Your North America and South America. Then the interaction, obviously, as everybody knows, wasn't a happy interaction. The native population was basically decimated, destroyed, and that led to colonization. This was the first wave of colonization of Europe across the world, where massive numbers of Europeans were transplanted from Europe into non-European lands. Right? So, for example, if you now go and visit Venezuela, visit Colombia, visit Mexico, obviously visit Canada, visit USA, what you will see is majority of the people that you will see are actually of, if you go far back enough, European ancestry. Right? They are not sort of native. I mean, the use of these words is difficult, but let's just, be unproblematically, let's use them. They are not really natives of this land. American Indians were, the Native Americans were. And this is something that will lead to, this is the first wave of colonization. This will lead to further waves of colonization. So, for example, what we know of as colonization in India and Pakistan, which happens much later on, this will be your second wave of colonization. Right? Why is this important? Why is this seen as occasioning the rise of modernity? Is because first, it will signal the rise of European power across the world. Okay? Along with the rise of European power, when you pair it with things like the Industrial Revolution and the French Revolution that we talked about, you will not just see, European political systems, but also European economic systems spreading across the world. Okay. Now, a fourth component that people have often talked about is say, capitalism. Okay, capitalism, it's a very, very nebulous word. It's a very convoluted word. For now, all I mean by capitalism is economic planning, which is driven purely or predominantly by the motive of searching for profits. Okay, this is tied. जो ऊपर मैंने दो चीजें डिस्कस की उसके साथ ही it's connected. Sorry, Ali, I might switch to Urdu because I'm looking at Pakistani faces and this happens all the time. I'll tend to switch to Urdu. But what I just said was that to understand capitalism, some of the stuff that I already mentioned can be utilized. So, Industrial Revolution brings about urbanization. Okay, that's part of your capitalism in terms of how it will impact society. But maybe even to a certain extent, one could say Industrial Revolution itself was driven by capitalism, right? One of its causes was capitalism in the sense that capitalism wanted to maximize its profits, and it thought that the better way to produce was not through guilds, was not through agrarian pre-industrial methods, but rather in a factory assembly line that would create the most amount of production for any unit of effort put in by the workers or the expenditure of machinery, of capital. That will lead to this change in economic thinking will lead to all kinds of technological and social changes. Okay? So this would be another cause that people have talked about. Similarly, some people have tried to talk about modern science. What do I mean by modern science? Predominantly just that experimental methods. Okay? Checking ways or verifying your theories on the basis of experimental, experiential proofs rather than arguing on the basis of logic. Then, just to explain this a little more, why would this be seen as the cause of modernity is that sometimes scholars will say, well, it was because of changes in science that we even decided to develop something like the technology available in Industrial Revolution. If those changes hadn't happened, I mean, to give you a much more interesting example, is to say most of you probably in high school at some point or the other have studied gravity and projectile motion, right? The person who worked on this stuff, Newton, who came up with these theorems, he in many ways was motivated by not just pure search for knowledge, but also to help develop the best forms of weaponry or cannons, right? Projectile motion kya consider kar raha hai, right? At the end of the day, you're looking at, practically speaking, you're looking at the movement of a cannonball. So the point is that how you're conducting your scientific research was often connected with how you wanted to conquer the world or drive your power in the world. And then the last thing is secularism. Secularism over here meaning that you want to separate religion from playing a major role in governing your society. Discussions of God and things like that being used to, or not, rather not being used to set up societies, values such that they would play a part in how government should run, who should be elected, who is eligible for office, is tarah ki cheezein, like all of this stuff, taking religion out of it and keeping it purely on the basis of some sort of a rational or philosophical understanding of the world and society that you live in. I'm using a very big word over here, secularism, but even this can be connected with some of the earlier ones, right? The American and French Revolution, when I said that people were protesting against the divine right of kings, that was the big point in the French Revolution, not so much in the American Revolution, but definitely in the French Revolution, that it was part of this thinking process which said, just because God has appointed you or the church has called you a ruler, we don't agree with that kind of explanation of why you should be ruling over us. Right? So anyway, the point is, the collective point of all of this is to say that, look, depending on who you are and where you're studying and what kind of interest you have, you will understand modernity in different ways. This gets to be so big and broad. I mean, I still haven't considered, lots of other things over here. But my point is to tell you that this gets so confusing that some historians, especially those who are philosophically inclined and are not that empirically inclined, they're not interested in looking at how economic changes are taking about, they will say something like this. They will say that actually all of these changes that I talked to you about, whether societal, whether economic, whether technological, whether scientific, they were basically driven by certain philosophical, conceptual changes that came about within Europe or within European thinkers. And there are different thinkers that these people will point to, but one very famous one that keeps getting pointed to again and again as providing the source or the ground on the basis on which the rest of the things will follow or will be built upon it. That thinker is René Descartes. You probably, if you have not heard of his name, you've probably still heard of "I think, therefore I am." Right? It's a very famous phrase associated. Whenever I'm teaching philosophy classes, people might not know anything about philosophy, but they will know "I think, I think, therefore I am." They will know that. Another one which I often hope, this is a side note, another one that I often hope they would know is "Know thyself." They don't know that, and I'm sure over the next 2 years, this is a concept that will come up a lot, again and again. Knowing oneself versus deriving your existence through your thought. Okay, anyway, so you might be wondering, but wait, how are all these massive historical, socio-historical, political changes that I described above, how could they all be connected with what was happening in the mind of one or two of, at best, 10 or 15 philosophers? This is a question for intellectual historians that they often sit down and discuss. I will just try to illustrate a few ways in which this would happen, right? So let's consider the Industrial Revolution. What is the Industrial Revolution saying? Go ahead into the forest, cut down the trees, log them, send them to the factories, make furniture, right? Things around you, make them in a factory. Okay, this logic is, this pattern of taking natural resources, destroying them, making commodities out of them can be understood broadly as, well, the world is exploitable. Okay? It is there for us to be used. Right? So that would be that one conceptual move that has to happen before you go out and you chop down the trees and bring them into the factory. So before the Industrial Revolution, you will have you'll start thinking of the world as exploitable. Now, behind that, they will say there's another philosophical move. What's that philosophical move? It's this mind-body dualism. This is something that you might come across a lot when you're studying modern philosophy. Mind-body dualism से मतलब क्या है यहाँ पे? Like, just to give you a quick illustration, when Descartes says, I think, therefore I am, what he's really trying to do is search for a certain kind of certainty, because he's so worried about everything being uncertain. He's not sure whether God exists, he's not sure whether the church is right, he's not sure whether scriptures are there, he's not sure that he's interacting with his dog, whether his dog actually has a mind like he does. He's not sure whether colors are actually in an object, or are they just something that our mind puts in the object. So there are all kinds of concerns that he's dealing with, and he will say something like this, that look, no matter what happens, one thing I can be absolutely sure about is that I am thinking. Even if I'm doubting everything, even if I think nothing makes sense, even if I think everything false, I cannot doubt the fact that I am still thinking about these things. If I am thinking about these things, that means that I must exist. At least this much is certain, that I must exist. Right? From that he will say, okay, but if I exist, who am I? What am I? Am I my body? Am I, the hair on my hands and the color of my skin? Or am I the mind that is thinking? And he will say, between your body and your mind takes primacy. That is the more important thing. That is where truths are discovered. And everything else is a secondary thing. Okay? I'm doing a lot of violence to Descartes, but for now we have to abide by this violence. Right? So the point is, what will happen behind, now going back to the point that Industrial Revolution, for it to happen, you need to speak of the world exploitable. And behind that is the idea that a thinking mind can do anything with this world because that world is not valuable to begin. Okay? The truth of myself is in my mind, not in the world outside. So the stuff outside of my mind is not something that is worthy of as much respect. Is that clear? Am I clear enough? Similarly, I'm not going to go through all of these because I'm also worried about time, but so similarly, let's look at the French and the American Revolution. This is basically a demand for political freedoms. Why demand for political freedoms? Why are people saying that, God put a ruler in place, we should be listening to the ruler? That is not going to be the important thing anymore, but rather that I as an individual have rights and I need to assert my rights. Where will this come from? Again, this idea that the mind or my subjectivity or me as a subject, right? I as a subject has some integral worth to it, has certain value to it, has certain dignity to it that cannot be taken away from it. Why? Because I am the source of every other truth that I know in this world. That source, I think, therefore I am. I know I am thinking, hence I know I am existing, and that's the only thing that I can be absolutely certain about. And from that, Descartes and other thinkers like him will try to derive other truths of the world. Right? Even that there is a world outside of me, they will try to derive from that. This is a more complicated philosophical move. But all I want to illustrate right now is, like, all these things that we were talking about earlier on as causing modernity, as bringing about modernity, in the hands of certain philosophers or in the hands of certain intellectual historians, shouldn't really just be traced back to the Industrial Revolution or the French Revolution, things like that, but rather, okay, certain philosophical changes or changes in your thinking that come about within Europe, and Descartes is a very good example of that. Okay. So, the big point I wanted to finish this on, what modernity specifically is and how it comes about, is debated a lot. Okay? Within philosophers, it's all about how conceptual changes happen. Within social historians, some of the stuff in the earlier list. How history is written. Is remember this, these terms, modern, traditional, pre-modern, post-modern, all of these things are terms of what we call terms of art. Okay? Like somebody came up with these terms at some point in time. They are used by certain people for certain purposes. There are no like objective ways of saying this is what modern is, this is what pre-modern is. So the point over here is that people who started using the word modern were already living in the modern world. They were not living in the pre-modern world. Now one might say, oh wait, no. In Karachi, I experience a modern life, but you know, when I'm in Badin, over there, I'm experiencing a pre-modern life. We can have that kind of a discussion, but for the most part, we would say that when you're talking about modern world, the non-modern world has already stopped existing. So the comparisons that are going to happen are basically what I experience around me versus something that is in my mind, in my imagination. Again, this is not me saying that somebody when people are using these words traditional, modern, or non-modern, and pre-modern and modern, that they're doing something wrong. All I'm saying is one needs to understand that a lot of this comparison is the work of imagination. Okay, we are imagining what the pre-modern world used to be like, and then trying to compare it with the world around us. Obviously, there are lots of problems of historical method or historiography, how you do this. This will arise, but just keep this in mind, right? Over the next few months, you should keep this point in mind. But nonetheless, moving forward, what are some of the differences that people have tried to describe between the modern world and the pre-modern world? One, socially speaking, increasing connectivity between the world. And this is something that you guys are still experiencing, right? So if you think of the conquest of the Europeans, conquest of the New World by the Europeans, what did that do? At that point in time, you basically had 3 or 4 geographically isolated regions of the world. You had your Eurasian mass, you had your Afro-Asian mass, you had your Pacific mass, and then you had your, which is basically Australia, ab samjhe uski baat ho rahi hai. And then you had your the American mass, right? The North America and South America. These 4 geographical zones, इसके अंदर से 2 जो थे काफी isolated थे एक दूसरे से, the Americas and Australia, the Pacific zone. They were brought into contact with the rest of the world, or one can turn it around, the rest of the world was brought into contact with them. But the point is that the world became connected, okay? And that is something that we're still experiencing now. There is this increasing kind of connectivity, right, over Skype and such, that is allowing greater number of people to communicate with increasing ease. Okay, so that's one way in which people will say modern is different from pre-modern. The sense of separatedness amongst people was much greater in the pre-modern or in the traditional society. Another point that might arise is this philosophical, epistemologically, how are they different? One, like I've already touched upon this, is empirical methods of verification. As we maybe at some point in the future, I think 2 weeks from now or something, I'll be teaching another class dealing with this issue more in detail. But for now, just think of it this way. If somebody were to tell you that that gravity exists versus somebody were to show you a thing falling in front of you, which one would you find more convincing, right? So empirical methods of verification is one of the distinguishing marks that people would say belongs to modernity as opposed to pre-modern times, in which truth was oftentimes derived from authority. Who you are what your experiences have been, uh, who has given you the permission to speak, right? Those were the things that carried weight rather than whether you can verify your claim or not. Similarly, another part of the epistemological or philosophical difference between modern and the pre-modern will be a widespread recognition of doubt. ठीक है अब आप देखिए even this can be connected with the earlier point about diversity and people getting connected. It becomes increasingly difficult for anybody, any one individual, to maintain the same level of certitude and certainty in their beliefs when they're confronted by not just one or two differences, but 15,000 differences, right? So on the one hand, somebody might say, yeah, this is how men should be. This is how women should be. That's easier to say when you don't have in your society that much diversity of roles of men and women. But once you're confronted by a society in which there are 7, 8 different kinds of roles that men and women each can play, then you might not be that comfortable in saying, no, but the way I thought men and women should be, that is the way it should be for everybody else in the world. The point over here being what? That increasing connectivity across the world between different people and different cultures, bringing about a certain kind of recognition that you have to be a little careful in asserting the truths that you think you believe in because they might not be as obvious to everybody else. Okay. Is there anybody here, the people that I can look at in the room, is there anybody here who's read Charles Taylor? Can I see a show of hands? Nobody? Okay, good. If you guys are interested in these things, the one person that I always recommend, unfortunately, he writes books which often go over 1,000 pages, but his YouTube lectures are widely available. He's probably the most important thinker for me when it comes to trying to understand what modernity is, right? So Charles Taylor, you might want to look him up. Similarly, moving on, another thing that can be pointed to as the difference between the modern and the pre-modern would be political, rise of the nation state. Now over here, I'm not just talking about demands for political freedoms, but also a very different way of organizing your communal life. Like right now, the world that we live in Pakistan, people find it strange if somebody were to say, जी मैंने खुदा के कहने पे I have killed because God commanded me to kill. You might find that very strange. Like generally people will treat that with a sense of skepticism. But if somebody were to say, I killed because my country commanded me to, or because my military commanded me to, you don't find that strange. That seems to work. Yeah, that's why people kill. If militaries kill, that's more acceptable versus some guy standing up somewhere and saying, God and Prophet asked me to kill you, right? Why does this happen? That we are much more accepting of violence committed by states and violence committed in the name of the state or the nation state that is essentially connected to a different way of understanding how community is. Like as an individual, my primary responsibility is with the nation that I'm a part of, right? So Pakistani nation, Urdu speaking nation, however you want to pass that out, but that nation and then the representation of that nation at the level of politics in the hands of a government is seen as so natural, is seen as so acceptable that if you were to talk about this, when I talk to people about this right now, they're like, "Samajh mein nahi aa raha." Like, what are you saying? But this is how things should always be, or should be. But unfortunately, they were not always like this. Before the 17th century or so, even in Europe, your state, neither your nation, was the primary way through which you identified the community that you belong to. Your community was either your family, your clan, your neighborhood, right? Whatever village you lived in, whatever small city you lived in, the people within that, or your religious community, right? So that was predominantly the way of understanding religious of your communal affiliation rather than what we have now as nation state. And nation states predominance can be, you can sort of understand it this way. Is there any place on the face of this earth, any inhabitable place where people can go and live, place on this earth which is not claimed by a nation state? When you imagine any geographical space, you'll say in your mind, oh, it's connected with some state. This conceptual move that has happened, this is quite radical. In the pre-modern world, there were vast open spaces that were up for grabs. Right? You didn't have boundaries, you didn't have hadbandi, sarhade nahi thi. Khair, anyway, this is something that I care about a lot, the rise of the nation state. So I can go on and on about this. In this whole discussion, the two things that I can go on and on about without stopping is probably the rise of the nation state and the mind-body dualism. So I should keep myself in check and move on. Another difference that people might point to economically between modern and the pre-modern would be I've hinted at it at some level, urbanization, mechanization, and movement of capital. By movement of capital over here, what I mean is the ease with which, by capital we mean sarmaya, right? Means through which resources can be put to productive use. The ease with which that happens across the globe. Okay, so think of it this way. The British coming to India, taking cotton from here, processing it, making clothes out of it, and then selling it back to the Indians. Right? This is the movement of capital, essentially. This sort of thing starts around the same time period as the Industrial Revolution, or maybe a little before that. But the point is that increasingly, investors, increasingly big business people will find ways of moving their capital across the world. And this is something that we still see now in Pakistan, and across the world. You're seeing this happening much more easily. So, for example, the IMF, the World Bank, oftentimes when they are, Pakistan is in the middle of this big debate about the IMF loan. One of the things that they will always tie with the giving of an IMF loan is the opening of your local economy to foreign investors. Right? The very famous one, the very famous case in Pakistan is that of your K Electric, the electricity providers in Karachi. It used to be a government department, but foreign investors were able to buy it. Another example, similarly, in the case of Pakistan, is the movement of mobile company, cell phone carriers. Mostly foreign capital coming into Pakistan. Some people think it's a good thing, some people think it's a bad thing. I'm not getting into that right now. But the point is, this is often seen as one of the big differences between the pre-modern world and the modern world. And again, this is connected to increasing connectivity of people. When that is happening, not only will capital be easier to move, but eventually you will also see the labor will also start moving much more quickly. Fair. So some of the, I'll just discuss one more. Scientific is probably the more important one to consider. When I keep saying scientifically things have changed from the pre-modern world into the modern world, actually over here one could also say philosophically, but I want to focus on the scientific part, because if you go to a typical physics department, right, that you, let's say actually not even now, let's say 100 years ago, if you went to University of Cambridge and you walked into the physics department over there and you said something like this: bodies fall, right? Mass falls because it has a goal towards falling. That will sound very strange to, if it's sounding strange to you, then you guys are also thoroughly modernized in that sense in your thinking. To a 19th century physics department at the University of Cambridge, that will sound very strange, because they'll say, wait, causes are something that are logical, are often, causes are something that are prior in time, okay, not after in time. So think of it this way. If I'm pushing something, okay, the cause precedes the effect, versus cause is at the end and it's pulling the effect towards itself, okay? Teleology is one way to describe it. It's how things are moving towards their goal, how things are moving towards their purpose, how they're fulfilling those things. This will be disregarded entirely within your scientific community and to a very large extent within your philosophical community as well as a valid principle of investigation. Iska impact, the kinds of impact this thing will have on on our individual psychologies. I think Ali will look at some of the text in the second section where you will be able to appreciate it. But let's put it this way, to put it very simply. I'm much more interested as an individual human being. I'm much more interested in what my parents did to me as a child and how that explains my behavior now versus how I'm going to perfect my soul and what is its destiny. Okay, does that make sense? That kind of a difference, this way of when you drop teleology as a way of thinking within the scientific and philosophical world, eventually it will have an impact and it will lead to differences even within your individual psychological selves. Khair, okay, so let's try to go through number 3 right now and very quickly. But why does modernity matter, right? So what we've looked at, how somebody might say modernity is different from pre-modern and what are the causes behind those differences. Okay, now why does all of this matter? Again, there's so much debate on this issue. I don't want to get into giving you different people's perspective. So right now, Omar Shaukat's voice is kind of taking over, okay? And I'm going to speak as an individual in my sense of things right now. I would encourage you guys to think about this on your own. I think you can ask a question at the end. Let me finish and then we'll have 10-15 minutes for questions. I can stay back. It's not a problem. I don't have to wait at 9:50. Okay. Before I was describing, now I'm trying to do a little more evaluation. So in terms of good and bad. Okay, so if somebody were to ask me what has been the bad effect of modernity, I think I would say, first of all, there's an environment that is created, a social life, a social fabric that is created, which is distancing people from God. Okay, by God, I don't necessarily mean like God as just God, but this sense, right, that there is something beyond this world. That there is not everything has to be focused on this world. Just this sense is going to keep getting hammered again and again and again because you have so many things. Now think about some of the stuff that I've said. Conceptually, you're not interested in what this world is moving towards. What you're interested in, how did this world come to be? So there is much more discussion about the Big Bang Theory as opposed to what is the akhirah of this world. And if you are going to talk about the akhirah of this world, you're predominantly going to stay within the framework of, environmental destruction is going to happen and this world will cease to exist because we will blow ourselves up in a nuclear catastrophe or some sort of global warming effect. Right? So that's one way in which how changes in your thinking are affecting the fabric of life that you experience. Okay. Similarly, the pace of modern life. The pace of modern life, because it's so concerned with technological changes, with change for the sake of change, that oftentimes you will feel disoriented. And in that disorientation, you generate this sense that you're always running behind something. You're always chasing your next immediate goal as opposed to sort of finding those spaces where you can calmly recollect yourself and think about, like I said, the ultimate goal, the ultimate purpose of life. Now, similarly, giving you another way of talking about some of the problems associated with modernity is the rise of instrumental rationality is often a term that people will use, or what I've been calling efficiency concern, right? Capitalism, industrialization, all of these things will talk so much about efficiency, 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 efficiency. The way to distinguish between instrumental rationality on the one hand, right, and by that we mean efficiency-oriented thinking, versus non-efficiency or non-instrumental rationality is to say that you really, really think about what the ends are, what the purposes are for which we are working towards something. Wow. As opposed to, somebody is giving you a goal, what's the best way to execute it and quickly deliver the results. This is something, I mean, I don't know how many, like what's the age group that I'm talking to over here, but if you've worked in corporate environments, I'm lucky I've never really worked in corporate environments, but I have worked in, let's say, accounting and finance kind of positions for smaller companies. Efficiency is a concern that you hear about all the time. When people are making public policy, they will constantly talk about efficiency rather than thinking about, well, what kind of change would be a good change given our ultimate goal, and not, again, in terms of immediate goal. There's always going to be a goal, which is going to be your immediate goal. Instrumental rationality says how to best get there. Let's focus on that. Let's focus on the process as opposed to the end that we're after, right? And this kind of thinking will keep getting hammered again and again, because you don't just have capitalism, you don't just have modern science, you don't just have technology, but even you have at the level of socio-political discussion, this collective effect that we don't want to talk about, something which is greater than or bigger than this world around us. Okay. Now, interestingly, अभी तो मैंने दो चीजें जो बैग के बारे में बताई, I've talked about how this affects our conception of ultimate reality of this world. It also affects us in other places, right? I'm calling this in my notes. I didn't realize it when I was typing it, but it's a very fancy word, autotelic, which basically just means its own goal, right? Its own telos, its own purpose. The aesthetic domain ke andar, right? So not, I talked about the religious domain, but I'll also say in the aesthetic domain, for something purely for the joy of it, right? The joy of doing something purely for the sake of its own enjoyment that it gives you, or it is fulfilling its purpose in the moment. That kind of a thing will be seen as a wastage of time. So, I mean, you know, in Pakistan we have this very famous idiot. I'm sorry I'm using this word, Taimur Saab. We have Parvez Woodboy, who loves raising this point that if we are praying 5 times a day, how will we create efficiency in our workplaces? So we should stop praying so that we can work better. I mean, that's the worst kind of form of display of this instrumental rationality at work, where it is not just, I mean, and I'm pretty sure in his thinking, it's not just that he's against praying. Anything that will be wasting time. So if you tell him that 5 times a day, I'm going to take out some time and I'm going to sit in front of the Mona Lisa, or I'm going to sit in front of the images of the Masjid al-Qurtuba, right? He will probably not like that. So the point is that this kind of aesthetic enjoyment is also getting affected, not just your religious. Okay? Now, the last point I want to make, I've given you how some of these things, modernity is changing the way we think and distancing ourselves from this question, which really should be at the forefront of our lives, is what is my ultimate goal? What is the ultimate reality? But I also want to say that while modernity is, you know, has created lots of problems, one shouldn't fall in the trap of just thinking that it's only creating problems. Right? It might be doing some good. What good might that be? Now, one thing which can, you know, it's the same thing. If you look at it from one angle, it can come across as pretty bad, pretty terrible thing. And from another angle, it can come across as a pretty, I mean, I think it as at least, if not as a great thing, but at least as something that one should think about much more soberly rather than just dismiss it, is this problem of doubt. Thinking doubt over here doesn't just mean something like, oh, I'm confronted, but sorry, there's a lot of echo.
वो मैं बंद करता हूँ, मेरा माइक खुला था.
Okay, sorry. Chale. What was I saying? Yes, I doubt. So doubt shouldn't just be treated as the result of something in which, when I'm confronted with diversity, with lots of people sitting in front of me, and I'm not able to defend myself, that I enter into doubt, but also as let's that maybe there is something about the way I think of God in the first place, that the conception of God that I have creates room for me having doubts. Now, what do I mean by that? What I'm saying is a pretty heavy thing in terms of, like, really it's not to be explained over 5 minutes or 10 minutes, but I'm trying to do that. So if you have questions, please ask me. But what I mean is something like this. Doubt, viewing doubt, not just as a fact of reality, but rather as something that maybe God even encourages us to engage in at some level. Is that level of doubt that maybe God even encourages us to engage in? An example that I would give from the history of Islam is the experience of somebody like Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. Right? He is very famous for experiencing a certain kind of crisis in which he was able to question, and he was at the height of his intellectual and Islamic sort of credentials. He was the greatest scholar of his own time. He was widely recognized as such. And he experienced a certain kind of doubt in which he said, you know what, even something as basic as whether God exists or not, I'm not sure about this. And he said that he was suffering from a certain kind of sickness. In that sickness, he felt that he was a hypocrite of the highest order while he's teaching fiqh, hadith, all of those things in Baghdad. He felt that he couldn't really believe in anything, right, that he was saying. But he used that as a way of rising above his doubt and searching for a certain kind of certainty that was able to address that doubt. Now, in his own life, he was pretty lucky that he was able to find that certainty, that addressed that doubt. But even if you remove his attainment of that certainty, what I'm saying is, imagine it this way. If Ghazali were to die without experiencing that certainty and he had just died in that state of doubt, would that have just been a bad thing? The reason I'm asking this question is this hypothetical situation with Ghazali is probably comparable to the world that we live in right now. Most people have doubts about the truths that they believe in, and that's how probably they're going to move on. Okay? Now, is this, in my perspective at least, I don't think this is a bad thing. I'm putting it very simplistically because maybe, and one should think about this, all the doubts that the modern world makes us confront, right? Challenges from science against religion, challenges of diversity against your conception of what is the good life, philosophical objections, like pretty heavy philosophical objections to the beliefs that you hold. All of those things are there so that we may tear away, slowly separate what we think is certainty, but it's really not, from our own selves. Okay? In that sense, I think modernity might not just be a bad thing. It might be a good thing to the extent that it helps us get rid of false certainties. Right? I mean, to give you one example, agar Descartes, jo hai, if he was able to find certainty in the self, right? I think, therefore I am. How many of us can point to examples from within the Islamic world, right? What I would call Muslim fundamentalists, who find certainties in Islam in such a simplistic way. Oh, that is what the Prophet said, hence it must be done in this way. Oh, this is what the penal code of Islam is, it must be implemented across the world in this way. Like, you find that one little bit of information that you feel absolutely cannot be changed. It cannot be changed in any environment. Right? So this is, I'm saying epistemologically, philosophically, this is doing the same kind of work. You're searching for a certainty which you're not able to find, but you hold on to something, even though it looks like, sort of castles built in the sand, but you hold on to it with so much effort because you are creating a certain kind of false certainty. And you are doubting, or you rather you think that doubt is a bad thing, hence you immediately run towards certain kinds of certainty. But what I'm proposing is maybe doubt is not a bad thing because it can be that element which will help you shave off all the false certainties that you experience. I'll stop at this point, and however much time you guys need, I'm here, and let's have a discussion.